The steel fortress Dominic Valero glanced at his watch. 6:15 a.m. Perfect timing. The Valero Technologies headquarters stood empty except for the security guards who nodded respectfully as he strode through the lobby. These early hours were sacred to him, undisturbed time when he could think without the chaos of human interaction. At 43, Dominic had built a $4.2 billion empire through relentless focus and emotional discipline. His corner office overlooked Seattle's skyline, the furnishings minimal and functional, just like his approach to life. On his desk sat a small plaque with words that had guided him since he started with nothing. Sentiment is the enemy of success. The elevator chimed at 7:30 a.m. Dominic frowned. No one arrived this early except, "Good morning, Mr. Valero. I've adjusted your schedule to accommodate the Singapore call." Olivia Parker walked in without knocking, setting down a steel thermos. "And before you tell me you've already had coffee, that machine in your apartment makes brown water, not coffee." Olivia had been his executive assistant for 3 months, the longest anyone had lasted in the position recently. She wore practical clothes, minimal jewelry, and carried herself with quiet confidence that bordered on irreverence. She was extraordinarily efficient, which was the only reason Dominic tolerated her occasional impertinence. "The Nakamura acquisition files?" he asked, ignoring the coffee comment. "Already uploaded to your secure drive, flagged the concerning elements on pages 37 and 142. She turned to leave, then paused. "Also, your sister called? Twice. Something about your father's birthday dinner." Dominic stiffened. "I'll handle it later. She said you'd say that. She also said to remind you that later is what you said last year, and the year before." Olivia's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held something, not pity, but understanding. "Thank you. Ms. Parker, that will be all." Throughout the morning, Dominic moved through meetings with mechanical precision. The board members, the development team, the marketing executives all received the same calculated attention. Emotions were inefficient. Sentimentality was weakness. He'd learned this watching his father's restaurant chain collapse after making decisions based on loyalty rather than logic. At lunch, the door opened again. Olivia placed a container on his desk. "You have 15 minutes before the Westridge call. Enough time to eat something that didn't come from a vending machine." "I didn't ask for lunch." "No, but your stomach has been growling loud enough to register on the Richter scale." She turned to his whiteboard where he'd been mapping acquisition strategies. "Your approach to the European market is missing something." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Is providing unsolicited business advice part of your job description, Ms. Parker?" "No, but neither is making sure you don't pass out during your TED Talk next month." She pointed to a section of his diagram. "You're focusing on market penetration but ignoring cultural adaptation. It's why Thornhill's expansion failed last quarter." For a brief moment, Dominic was speechless. She was right, and she'd noticed something his entire strategy team had missed. "I'll take it under consideration," he said finally. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "The salmon is from Pike Place. Eat it while it's warm." Then she was gone, closing the door softly behind her. Dominic stared at the container, then at the closed door. Something uncomfortable settled in his chest, not irritation, but something he couldn't quite identify. He pushed it aside and opened his laptop. Sentiment was the enemy of success. And Olivia Parker, with her observant eyes and unexpected insights, was beginning to feel dangerously like sentiment. Cracks in the armor. The quarterly review meeting was running 15 minutes over schedule, and Dominic Valero despised inefficiency. He watched as his chief marketing officer fumbled through explanations for the department's underperformance, feeling his patience wearing thin. "What Jerome is trying to say," Olivia interjected from her position by the door where she'd been taking notes, "is that the demographic analysis shows our messaging missed the mark with the 25-35 age bracket because we prioritized technical specifications over emotional connection." The room fell silent. Executive assistants didn't speak during executive meetings. It was an unwritten rule at Valero Technologies. But instead of the sharp reprimand everyone expected, Dominic simply nodded. "Show me the data," he said. Olivia pulled up a series of graphs on the main screen, walking through a concise analysis that even Jerome hadn't fully grasped. When she finished, Dominic dismissed everyone except his core team. "Implement Ms. Parker's recommendations," he instructed Jerome, "and schedule a follow-up next week." Later that afternoon, Dominic found himself standing at his office window, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. 3 floors below in the courtyard, he spotted Olivia sharing her umbrella with Rosita, one of the cleaning staff. They were laughing about something, and Olivia's free hand was moving animatedly as she spoke. "Mr. Valero?" His CFO, Bennett, had entered. "About the quarterly projections. Did you know Ms. Parker speaks fluent Spanish?" Dominic interrupted, still watching the scene below. Bennett looked confused. "No, sir. She does. And Portuguese. And she apparently has a background in behavioral economics that wasn't on her resume." He turned from the window. "How did she end up as an assistant?" "I'm not sure that's relevant to—" "Everything about my company is relevant to me, Bennett." The following week brought the first signs of trouble. A major security breach had compromised client data, and the PR nightmare was unfolding in real time. Dominic had barely slept for 3 days, moving between crisis meetings and damage control calls. At 2 a.m., the office was eerily quiet. He rubbed his eyes, staring at columns of code that were beginning to blur together. "You need to sleep," Olivia said, appearing with a fresh pot of coffee despite his late-night text telling her to go home hours ago. "What I need is to find who's responsible for this disaster." She set the coffee down and closed his laptop. For anyone else, this would have been a firing offense. But Dominic merely stared at her, too exhausted to protest. "The forensic team has it handled. They'll report at 7 a.m. She pointed to the leather couch in the corner of his office. 3 hours of sleep will make you sharper than 0. "I don't have time for 3 hours, Mr. Valero." "Doctor's orders." He frowned. "You're not a doctor?" "No, but my father was. And he always said sleep deprivation makes geniuses function like fools." Something in her voice made him look up. There was concern there, but also something more. Respect, perhaps. Not for his money or his power, but for what he was trying to protect. The company, the employees who depended on it. The vision he'd sacrificed everything to build. 3 hours, he conceded finally. When he awoke, a light blanket had been placed over him, and a fresh shirt hung on his coat rack with a note. "Meeting prep on your tablet. Coffee in the thermos. OP." As the crisis gradually came under control, Dominic found himself watching Olivia more carefully. She treated everyone the same, from the janitors to the board members, with the same direct courtesy. She remembered details about people's lives. She anticipated problems before they arose, and strangest of all, people seemed happier when she was around, more engaged, more productive. One evening, as they worked late reviewing contracts, he finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why did you apply for this position? Your qualifications suggest you could be running your own division." Olivia looked up from her tablet, considering him for a moment before answering. "Because from here I can see how everything connects. How decisions at the top affect people at every level." She paused. "And because you built something extraordinary, Mr. Valero. Even if you've forgotten why you built it in the first place." The words lingered in the air between them, and Dominic felt something shift, like the first hairline fracture in a dam holding back emotions he'd long since buried. He turned back to his work without responding. But that night, for the first time in years, Dominic dreamed, not of spreadsheets or market expansions, but of things he'd given up long ago. Connection, laughter, and the peculiar warmth that came from Olivia Parker's uncompromising presence in his carefully ordered world. The collapse. The signs had been there for weeks. The occasional dizziness, the pressure in his chest, the headaches that wouldn't subside with aspirin. But Dominic Valero didn't have time for weakness, especially not with Valero Technologies on the verge of its most ambitious expansion yet. The Tokyo meeting had gone brilliantly. The European negotiations were progressing. Everything was falling into place according to his meticulous planning, except for the persistent voice of Olivia Parker. who had taken to leaving vitamins beside his coffee and scheduling gaps in his calendar that he promptly filled. "The board packet needs your final approval," she said, entering his office on a Tuesday morning that seemed like any other. "And the doctors at Swedish Medical rescheduled your physical again." "Third time's the charm?" Dominic barely looked up from his monitor. "Cancel it. The Singapore investors need a response by Thursday, which means you need to be alive to deliver it," she interrupted. "Your father died of a heart attack at 46, Mr. Valero. You're 43. His fingers froze over the keyboard. "How do you know about my father?" "It's my job to know things," she replied simply. He was about to respond when the room tilted suddenly. The pressure in his chest expanded like a balloon, and a cold sweat broke across his forehead. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. "Mr. Valero?" Olivia's voice sounded distant. "Dominic?" The use of his first name was so unexpected that he looked up, trying to focus on her face. He saw concern transform into alarm as she rushed toward him, already pulling out her phone. "I need an ambulance at Valero Tower, 47th floor," he heard her say as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. "Possible cardiac event." He wanted to protest. There were meetings scheduled, calls to make, a company to run, but his body had finally revolted against years of neglect, and as he slumped forward, the last thing he felt was Olivia's hand firmly gripping his, anchoring him to consciousness as everything else slipped away. The hospital room was unnervingly quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors. Dominic awoke disoriented, the sterile smell and fluorescent lighting momentarily confusing him. A severe exhaustion attack, the doctor said. Not a heart attack, but a warning shot. Next time, he might not be so lucky. Through the fog of medication, he became aware of someone sitting beside his bed. Not his sister, who lived in London and was presumably on her way. Not any of his executives, who were likely scrambling to manage in his absence. It was Olivia, her usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled, reading quietly from her tablet. She hadn't noticed he was awake yet, and for the first time, Dominic allowed himself to really look at her. There were shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than her usual neat bun. "Don't you have better things to do than watch me sleep?" His voice came out raspier than intended. She looked up, relief washing over her face before she composed herself. "Someone needed to intercept your sister's calls and prevent you from trying to run a multinational corporation from a hospital bed." She poured a glass of water and handed it to him. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." He took a sip. "What's the damage control?" "Bennett is handling operations. I've rescheduled the Singapore call. The board has been informed of your minor health incident, and the media knows nothing." She hesitated. "But there's something else." The serious tone in her voice made him tense. "What?" "The security breach from last month. It wasn't random." She lowered her voice. "I've been going through the data, and it appears someone deliberately targeted our new acquisition plans. Specifically, the Nakamura deal." Despite his weakened state, Dominic's mind sharpened instantly. "Someone inside?" "I think so. But I needed your authorization to dig deeper, and you were—" She gestured to the hospital bed. "So you did it anyway." He finished for her. A small, defiant smile appeared. "I figured it was easier to ask forgiveness than permission." For some reason, that made him almost smile back. "What did you find?" She pulled her chair closer, showing him the evidence she'd compiled. Unusual access patterns, targeted data extraction, communications that didn't add up. As she laid out her findings, Dominic was struck not only by her thoroughness, but by her genuine concern for the company. "For his life's work. Why?" he asked suddenly. She looked confused. "Why what?" "Why did you stay?" He gestured around the hospital room. "This isn't in your job description." For the first time since he'd known her, Olivia Parker seemed at a loss for words. She looked down at her hands before meeting his gaze again. "Because," she said finally, "contrary to what you might believe, Mr. Valero, people aren't just assets or liabilities. Sometimes people stay because they care." The monitor beside his bed registered a slight increase in his heart rate. He blamed it on the medication. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral, Your dedication is noted. But as he drifted back to sleep, the weight of her hand briefly touching his shoulder felt like both a comfort and a complication he wasn't prepared to analyze. Unexpected lessons. Dominic Valero's estate sat on 5 acres overlooking Puget Sound, a modernist marvel of glass and steel that reflected its owner's aesthetic. Impressive, isolated, and meticulously ordered. For the first time in its existence, however, the pristine space was in disarray. Medical equipment cluttered the living room. Folders and tablets covered the dining table. And most disrupting of all, Olivia Parker had commandeered his kitchen, insisting that recovery required proper nutrition, not the protein shakes and coffee that had sustained him for years. "This is unnecessary," Dominic protested, as she set a bowl of something hearty-smelling in front of him. 2 weeks of forced convalescence had not improved his mood. "I have a personal chef on call." "Who you never actually call," Olivia countered, taking the seat across from him. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you're actually resting instead of secretly working." The data breach investigation had revealed a complex conspiracy involving his former CFO, Bennett, and 2 board members with ties to a competing firm. The betrayal had hit harder than Dominic cared to admit, especially coming alongside his physical collapse. For a man who prided himself on control, the double blow was humbling. "The board meeting is scheduled for next Monday," Olivia informed him, scrolling through her tablet. "Dr. Weston says you can attend for 2 hours maximum, then it's back to rest." "I built this company from nothing," he said, frustration edging his voice. "I can't just sit here while it's in jeopardy." "It's not in jeopardy. The legal team is handling the Bennett situation. The interim CFO is competent, and I've implemented new security protocols that would make the Pentagon jealous." She looked up at him with that direct gaze that always made him feel slightly off balance. "The company will survive without you micromanaging every decision for a few weeks." He wanted to argue, but found himself distracted by the way the evening light caught in her hair, turning the ordinary brown into something richer, with unexpected highlights of auburn. It occurred to him that in 3 months of working closely together, he'd never really noticed these details before. "Why soup?" he asked suddenly. She blinked, thrown by the non sequitur. "What? You've brought soup 3 times this week!" "There must be a reason." A shadow crossed her face, so brief he almost missed it. "My mother made soup when things were difficult," she said after a moment. It was her way of saying everything would be okay, even when it wouldn't. The simple statement hung in the air, an unexpected glimpse into her life outside the office. Dominic found himself wanting to know more, a novel sensation for someone who generally avoided personal entanglements with employees. Was she right? Did things turn out okay? Olivia's smile held a complexity he hadn't seen before. "Sometimes. She died when I was 19. Cancer. I dropped out of my master's program to care for her." The revelation shifted something in his understanding of her. "That's why you didn't finish at Stanford." "You researched me?" She seemed amused rather than offended. "I research everyone who works closely with me." "Of course you do." She stood to clear the dishes. "And yes, that's why. Afterward, I needed to work rather than return to school. Life happens, Mr. Valero, regardless of our careful plans." As she moved around his kitchen with easy familiarity, Dominic watched her with growing curiosity. Here was someone who had faced profound loss, yet remained undimmed by it, who had adapted to circumstances beyond her control without becoming bitter, who seemed to understand something about life that had eluded him despite all his success. Later, as evening settled around the house, they sat in his study reviewing the latest company reports. The formal boundaries between them had blurred during his recovery, creating a strange new dynamic that was neither purely professional nor exactly friendship. "You never talk about your family," she observed as he signed the documents she'd prepared. "There's not much to tell. My sister lives abroad. My mother remarried and moved to Arizona. We're not close, by choice or circumstance." He looked up, startled by the directness of the question. "Does it matter?" "I think it might," she said quietly. To understand why someone who built an empire centered around connecting people seems so determined to remain disconnected himself. The observation struck uncomfortably close to a truth he rarely acknowledged. Valero Technologies' mission statement, building bridges in a digital world, seemed suddenly ironic in light of his own isolated existence. "My father," he said after a long silence, "believed that business and personal attachments couldn't coexist. He lost everything trying to save people who took advantage of his loyalty. So you decided to have neither attachment nor loyalty?" "I decided to be smart about where I invest my energy." Olivia nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. "There's a difference between being careful and being closed off entirely." She gathered the signed papers and stood. Just something to consider while you're forced to actually sit still for once. As she reached the doorway, Dominic found himself not wanting her to leave just yet. "Olivia," he called, the use of her first name still unfamiliar on his tongue. "Thank you for everything these past weeks," she turned, surprise evident in her expression. "You're welcome, Dominic." It was the first time he hadn't corrected her use of his first name. And as she smiled, a real smile, not the professional one she wore at the office, he felt something long dormant stirring to life inside him, something that felt dangerously like hope. The final investment rain lashed against the windows of Valero Tower as Dominic stood before the board of directors, his first full day back after nearly a month of recovery. The room crackled with tension. 3 empty seats where the conspirators had sat, nervous executives wondering what other changes might be coming, and Olivia Parker, seated not in her usual place by the door but at his right hand. "Valero Technologies stands at a crossroads," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Recent events have made clear that our foundation had weaknesses I failed to address. Today that changes." He outlined a restructuring plan that sent whispers through the room: new security measures, more transparent governance, shifts in leadership that elevated younger, more diverse voices. Throughout the presentation, he found his gaze returning to Olivia, drawing strength from her steady presence. When the meeting concluded, the board members filed out, some looking shell-shocked, others energized by the new direction. Only Olivia remained, gathering her notes with a small smile playing at her lips. "That went well," she observed. "They think I've lost my mind," he replied, loosening his tie, "or that my health scare affected my brain. You just showed genuine emotion in a board meeting. Of course they're concerned." Her teasing tone made him almost laugh, another change that had emerged during his convalescence. "The new direction is good, Dominic. It's what the company needs." "There's one more change I'm considering," he said, suddenly serious, "and I wanted to discuss it with you first." She tilted her head, curious. "Oh?" "I'm creating a new position, Chief Strategy Officer, someone who can see the connections between departments, anticipate problems before they become crises, and ensure our growth doesn't come at the expense of our culture." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "And you want my input on candidates?" "I want you to take the position." The proposal hung between them, altering the atmosphere as surely as if he'd opened a window to the storm outside. For once, Olivia looked genuinely startled. "That's a significant promotion." "It's the right move for the company," he said, then added more softly, "and it's what you deserve." She studied him for a long moment. "Is that the only reason?" The question cut to the heart of everything that had shifted between them. The long conversations during his recovery, the moments when professional boundaries had blurred, the growing awareness that Olivia Parker had become essential to him in ways that extended far beyond her job description. "No," he admitted finally. "It's not the only reason." That evening, they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching Seattle's lights glimmer through the rain. Olivia had agreed to consider the offer, but something still felt unresolved between them. "You know this complicates things," she said, turning to face him. "People will talk. People always talk. Let them." The Dominic Valero I met 3 months ago would never have said that. Her expression was thoughtful. "You've changed." "I've Recalibrated, he said carefully. Reassessed what matters. The admission cost him something. An acknowledgement that the philosophy that had guided him for decades might have been flawed. That success without connection was an empty achievement. That the woman standing before him had shown him a different way to live, not through lectures or demands, but through her quiet example. I used to think emotions were a liability, he continued. That personal attachments were incompatible with achievement. I was wrong. Olivia moved closer, the professional distance that had once defined their relationship now completely gone. Are you sure about that? Your empire was built on that belief. My empire nearly killed me, he countered. And when I was lying in that hospital bed, it wasn't the company I was thinking about. It was the woman who somehow saw past all my defenses and still chose to stay. The confession hung in the rain-washed air between them. For a man who had spent his life calculating risks and returns, this moment represented the ultimate gamble. Offering. His heart with no guaranteed outcome, no spreadsheet to predict success or failure. Olivia reached up, her hand gently touching his face. That's quite an investment strategy, Mr. Valero. The question is, he said, his voice low, is it worth the risk? Her answer came not in words, but in the closing of distance between them, in the warmth of her lips against his, in the promise of something neither of them had been looking for, but had found nonetheless. Later, as they stood watching the storm begin to clear, Dominic realized that his life's greatest achievement wasn't the company he'd built or the fortune he'd amassed. It was finding the courage to tear down the walls he'd constructed around his heart, and discovering that what waited on the other side wasn't weakness or distraction, but a strength more profound than anything he'd known before. With Olivia beside him, her hand firmly in his, Dominic Valero finally understood what had eluded him for so long. That true success wasn't measured in balance sheets or market share, but in the courage to invest in connections that couldn't be quantified but were infinitely more valuable. And for the first time in decades, he felt not just successful, but truly, completely alive.